The old Victorian mansion on Elm Street had belonged to the Ironwood family for half a century. Margaret, the lady of the house, had turned the spacious living room into a music room where she gave piano lessons. A stately Steinway, inherited from her mother, held a place of honor by the window, letting in soft daylight. Margaret was expecting a new student that spring day. Talia Vale was 5 minutes late and now stood on the doorstep, nervously rubbing the strap of her bag. She was tall, slender, with a mop of red hair gathered in a careless bun. "Come in, dear," Margaret smiled welcomingly. "You said on the phone you'd never played before?" "Yes, Mrs. Ironwood, I have. But music has always been a dream of mine. I'm a nurse at the Central Hospital, and sometimes one wants so much to take one's mind off all this." Margaret nodded understandingly. She led Talia to the instrument, talking about the history of the house, her love of music, and the importance of finding an outlet in creativity. The first lesson went easily. Talia grasped on the fly, and her long fingers confidently laid down on the keys. After class, they had tea in the cozy kitchen, and Margaret, mellowed by the warm atmosphere, began to talk about her family. "Here, look at this." She held out a silver-framed photograph to Talia. "That's my grandson, Hunter. The only grandson. Such a talented boy he was, played the piano too." "Was?" Talia interjected. Margaret's face darkened. "He changed. After his parents died, something snapped in him. I tried to replace his family, but..." She fell silent, looking out the window. In the picture, a handsome young man with dark hair and piercing gray eyes was smiling. But there was something disturbing in that look, some underlying pain. "He hasn't been here for a long time," Margaret continued quietly. "He calls sometimes, asking for money. I help, of course, but I'm afraid that the money isn't going for what he says it is." Talia noticed the older woman's hands trembling as she tucked the photograph back on the shelf. "I'm sorry to bore you with my problems." Margaret tried to smile. "Let's make an appointment for our next class. How about Tuesday?" As she was saying goodbye at the door, Talia heard the phone ring. Margaret flinched and hurriedly closed the door before she could even finish thanking her. In the silence that followed, Talia thought she heard a loud male voice from behind the door. She stood on the porch for a moment, but then resolutely walked down the steps. After all, it was none of her business. Talia came to music lessons twice a week. Within a month, she had mastered simple tunes and rejoiced like a child at every success. Margaret grew more and more attached to her new student, in whom she saw the daughter she never had. That Tuesday, Talia stayed late after class, engrossed in a conversation about Chopin. Suddenly, the front door swung open and a cool spring wind blew in, along with the tall figure of a young man. "Grandmother?" The voice was hoarse but pleasant. Hunter Ironwood himself stood in the doorway of the music room, leaning carelessly against the jamb. Leather jacket, worn jeans, 3-day stubble. He looked exactly as Talia had imagined him from Margaret's stories. "Hunter?" Margaret stood up from behind the piano, and Talia noticed her hands shaking. "Why didn't you give me a heads up? Thought I'd surprise you." He stepped into the room and his gaze stopped on Talia. "And who do we have here?" "My student, Talia Vale," Margaret introduced the girl. "Talia, this is my grandson, Hunter." Their gazes met. Hunter's gray eyes, the same ones from the photograph, looked studied and slightly mocking. Talia felt herself blush. "Nice to meet you," she said, rising. "I think I'll be going now." "Stay for dinner," Hunter suggested abruptly. "I brought some Italian wine. Grandmother, you wouldn't mind the company, would you?" Margaret hesitated. It was obvious that her grandson's appearance had thrown her off balance, but she couldn't refuse. "Of course, dear. Talia, stay." At dinner, Hunter took a shine to her. He talked about his travels, his work in real estate, his plans to start his own business. Margaret listened in silence, occasionally casting anxious glances at his hands, which he carefully hid under the long sleeves of his shirt. Talia could not take her eyes off his face. It was a bizarre combination of boyish charm and a dangerous attraction. He flirted, but he did it so gracefully that it was impossible to be offended or embarrassed. After dinner, Hunter volunteered to walk Talia to her car. In the cool spring air, his touch on her elbow was scalding. "You know, he said as he opened the door of her old Ford. "I'm going to be stopping by Grandma's more often now, especially on Tuesdays and Fridays." Talia smiled, unable to manage a traitorous blush. "Those are my class days." "I know," he replied simply. Margaret watched them from the second-story window. As Talia's car disappeared around the corner, she slowly sank into her chair and pulled an old photo album from her desk drawer. The pictures from 10 years ago showed Hunter smiling a different smile, an open, sincere smile. Now there was something predatory, alien in his eyes. He hugged his grandmother tightly before going to his room, and the sleeve of his shirt pulled up. Margaret could see the puncture marks before he hurriedly pulled back the cuff. Her heart clenched with pain and fear. But what could she do? Only pray that this time would be different, that her boy would finally come home. That night she had a nightmare. Hunter was playing a funeral march on the piano, and the keys under his fingers were stained with blood. As spring slowly turned to summer, Hunter did show up at her grandmother's house more often, always just in time for music lessons to end. Talia caught herself thinking of him more often as she worked at the hospital, fixing her hair before class, choosing her outfits more carefully than usual. Their first real date was at a small jazz club downtown. Hunter invited her to listen to live music. In the semi-darkness of the room, to the sound of his saxophone, he talked about his childhood, about his parents dying in a car accident, about how his grandmother tried to replace his family. "You know, she's a great woman," he said, twirling his glass in his hands, "but sometimes too right. Life is more complicated than she makes it out to be." Their kiss in the parking lot outside the club was like music, passionate and a little jagged, like a jazz improvisation. Talia felt like she was falling into a maelstrom, but she didn't care. 2 weeks later, Hunter introduced her to his friends. In a smoky bar on the edge of town, a strange crowd gathered. Tattooed bikers, girls with blurry makeup, loud laughter, and clinking bottles. They all called each other snakes. "This is my family," Hunter explained. "The Red Snakes is what they call us. We look out for each other." Jade stood out among them, a pale blonde with huge blue eyes. She immediately reached for Talia, as if seeking protection in her. "You're a nurse? How cool," she said, squeezing Talia's hand with cold fingers. "So you know all about medication, huh?" There was a desperation in her eyes that Talia knew all too well from her work at the hospital. Typical signs of a budding addiction, dilated pupils, nervous movements, needle marks on her arms hidden under long sleeves. Hunter noticed the look in her eyes. "Jade's a little unwell, but we're taking care of her. Aren't we, baby?" He patted Jade's hair like a little dog. Talia was noticing more and more oddities in Hunter's behavior. Phone calls he answered in another room, unexplained disappearances in the middle of the night, large sums of cash appearing out of nowhere. Margaret saw changes in her grandson, too. One day, when Hunter had gone on business, she showed Talia old photo albums. "This is where he's 12, won the school piano competition, and here's his high school graduation. He dreamed of the conservatory back then." There was such pain in her voice that Talia couldn't stand it. "Why don't you ask him straight out? About money, about his friends, about other things?" Margaret shook her head. "I've tried. He shuts down, withdraws. I'm afraid of losing him altogether." And a few days later, Jade showed up on the hospital's doorstep while Talia was on duty. She was shaking, a fever beating her. "Help me," she whispered. "I can't go on like this. Hunter promised to help, but—" Talia dragged her into the treatment room, but it was too late. She'd overdosed. The doctors had managed to save Jade, but that was only the beginning of the end. The hospital corridor was drowned in the dead light of fluorescent bulbs. Talia sat outside Jade's room, clutching a cold cup of coffee. For the 4th day in a row, her vital signs remained critical. Hunter had shown up just before morning, gaunt, red-eyed. "How is she?" "Stably heavy. Liver's failing, kidneys on the verge. Needs specialized care, Hunter. We can't give her everything she needs here." He ran a hand over his face. "I know. There's a private clinic in the suburbs, but they charge $15,000 up front. I don't have that kind of money." "What about insurance?" "What insurance, Talia? You know who we are?" He left without saying goodbye. 2 hours later, Talia heard shouting from the ward manager's office. Hunter demanding more treatment, threatening, cursing. That evening, she found him outside Margaret's house. He sat on the porch with his arms around his head. "She won't open," he said deafeningly. "I begged her, Talia. Been on my knees. 15,000 isn't money to her. But she keeps talking about official treatment, about a rehab center. She doesn't understand. Jade will be found there. She's in trouble with the law. She'll go to jail." Talia sank down beside him on the steps. "Maybe it's better this way. The prison hospital also has—" "No!" He jumped up. "You don't know what she's been through. I promised to protect her. Promised I wouldn't let her go missing." Footsteps were heard outside the door. "Hunter." Margaret's voice sounded tired. "I've said everything. I'll help, but only officially. Through doctors, through the system." "Screw the system!" He slammed the door with force. "You have that money. I'm your grandson. Can't you see how bad I feel? It's precisely because I'm your grandmother that I can't indulge in this. Talia girl, you're a medic. Explain it to him." Talia tried. All night she'd been telling Hunter about rehab programs, about how the system could help if given a chance. He listened in silence, staring at one point. At dawn, his phone rang. Jade's condition had deteriorated dramatically. In the car on the way to the hospital, he suddenly said, "You know, Grandma has a checkbook in her desk, and I know the code to the safe." "Hunter, no." It was like he didn't hear. 15,000, just 15,000, and Jade will live." The very expression Margaret had feared so much appeared in his eyes. Talia saw it more and more often. Hunted, animalistic, desperate. The man beside her was willing to do anything, absolutely anything. At the hospital, they were met by the bustle of the intensive care team. While the doctors fought for Jade's life, Hunter sat in the hallway, swaying from side to side and whispering something unintelligible. Then he stood up and slowly walked toward the exit. "Where are you going?" Talia called out to him. "Home," he answered without turning around. "To my grandmother's." Jade died at dawn. Her heart had stopped at 5 hours and 23 minutes in the morning, and no amount of effort by the resuscitation team had helped. Talia stood against the wall, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. She hadn't had time to grow attached to this girl, but her death felt like a personal defeat. The room smelled of medicine and despair. Nurses hurriedly turned off IVs and monitors. The doctor tiredly dictated the time of death. Talia stared at Jade's pale face. So young, so calm now. Somewhere in the hallway, Jade's mother was crying. A small woman in a shabby coat who had shown up at the hospital only yesterday, when it was clear there was no hope. Hunter was nowhere to be found. His cell phone was silent. Talia tossed between the hospital and Margaret's house, trying to find him, to warn him. She didn't know what she wanted to warn him about. That death changes people? That grief can turn love into hate? That sometimes $15,000 was the price not only of a life, but of a soul? She checked every place he could be. The West Corner bar was closed. The old warehouse was empty. Even the red snake bikers hadn't seen him since last night. Toward evening, it began to rain. Talia parked in front of the Ironwoods house. The lights were on in the windows of the music room, and through the sound of the rain came the sounds of Margaret's piano playing Chopin, the same nocturne Talia had recently learned. The music sounded broken, as if the pianist was putting all her pain and anxiety into it. Suddenly, the music was cut off. There was the clinking of broken glass. Shouts. Talia jumped out of the car but stopped at the porch. Through the loose curtains, she saw two figures, Margaret, straight as a string, and Hunter looming over her. In the dim light of the table lamp, their silhouettes seemed like characters in a macabre play. "You killed her!" His voice trailed off into a croak. "Your damned principles, your damned correctness! She could have lived! 15,000! Just 15,000! Rain drummed on the roof, drowning out the words. Droplets dripped down the glass, distorting the picture inside the room. Talia could see Margaret's hands shaking as she tried to maintain her dignity in the face of her raging grandson. "Hunter, listen." "No, you listen. You think you're better than everyone else? You think your money is more important than human life?" "I couldn't." Margaret's voice trembled. I wanted to help the right? Right? He laughed, and that laugh gave Talia goosebumps. You know what the right thing is? The right thing would be... His hand reached for the bronze bust of Chopin on the piano. Margaret must have noticed it too. She rushed to the door with unexpected speed for her age and slammed it shut in front of her grandson's nose. The lock clicked. "Open up!" Hunter banged on the door. "Open up, you old hag! You'll be sorry!" Talia retreated into the shadows as he scurried down the steps. In the lamplight, his face seemed a mask, distorted with rage, alien, terrifying. For a second, their eyes met, but it was as if he were looking through her, not recognizing her. All night, she couldn't sleep. In her apartment, she could hear the wind howling in the alleys, the rain pounding on the eaves. Several times, she dialed the police number, but hung up before she reached the last digit. What could she say? That the grandson was yelling at the grandmother? That she had a bad feeling? That she saw darkness in his eyes? She tried calling Margaret. The dial tone went on, but no one picked up. For a moment, Talia thought she heard music, the same Chopin nocturne over and over like a jammed record. But maybe it was only the wind. She arrived at Margaret's house early in the morning, as usual, in time for her lesson. Already from a distance, she noticed that the door was ajar. In the front garden, the wind was whipping wet leaves. On the porch were boot prints blurred by the rain. The music room was cold, the window was broken, sheets of sheet music scattered on the floor, the curtains fluttered like ghosts. Margaret sat at the piano with her head resting on the keys, as if she had dozed off in the middle of a night concert. Only a small dark puddle on the snow-white keyboard told her it was not a dream. A bronze bust of Chopin lay on the floor. The eternal calmness of the great composer was frozen in his cold eyes, and next to it was a crumpled photograph, a little boy at the piano, a happy grandmother, music that should have saved but didn't. Talia screamed. The detectives showed up 40 minutes after the police were called. Ronald Shaw, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a tired face, and Esther Floyd, a lean woman with a short haircut and a tenacious gaze. They methodically examined the music room while the forensics team photographed every detail. "Tell me again, Miss Vale." Floyd pulled out a notebook. "You arrived for your music lesson." "Yes, at 9 in the morning, as usual. The door was ajar. I called out to Mrs. Ironwood, but she didn't answer. Then I went in and found her behind the piano," Shaw finished. "The time of death was between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning. Blow to the back of the head with a heavy object, presumably a bronze Chopin statue. She was lying on the floor, covered in blood." "Robbery?" Talia asked. Floyd shook her head. "Nothing was missing. No money or jewelry. The safe wasn't touched. It was private." Neighbors gathered behind a police cordon. An elderly Miss Donovan from across the street told of the night's screams. Some man was demanding to open the door, shouted something about money. Margaret wouldn't open it and he left, or pretended to leave. "What time was that?" "About 11 o'clock at night. I was going to call the police, but then it got quiet." Detectives interviewed all the neighbors. No one had seen any suspicious people, but many had heard music late at night. "It played a lot at night," said Mrs. Parker, who lived next door. "Especially when she was nervous. She said the music calmed her down." By late afternoon, forensic investigators found signs of forced entry at the back door. A broken latch, scratches on the lock. "Professional job," the examiner remarked. "Clean, quick, almost imperceptible." Shaw examined the ground beneath the windows. "The tracks lead to the alley. A car must have been parked there." "Did Mrs. Ironwood have any enemies?" Floyd asked Talia. "No, indeed. Everybody loved her. She just gave music lessons. Lived quietly, didn't bother anyone." "And relatives?" Talia faltered. "Just a grandson, Hunter Ironwood." "And where is he now?" "I don't know. He was here last night. They had a fight." Floyd jotted something down in her notebook. "What was the fight about?" "Over money. $15,000. His friend died yesterday in the hospital. She needed treatment at a private clinic, but Margaret refused to give the money." The detectives looked at each other. Shaw pulled out his cell phone. "Run Hunter Ironwood through the database." "Wait!" Talia grabbed his sleeve. "You don't think... That's impossible! He loved his grandmother!" "Love and money, Miss Vale," Floyd said quietly. The oldest motives for murder. Forensics were working on the house, blue police lights flashing, neighbors whispering outside the fence, and Talia stood in the middle of the music room, staring at the blood-stained keys, unable to believe that just yesterday Chopin had been played here. Margaret Ironwood's financial records told the story of the last months of her life. The bank statements, neatly laid out on Detective Floyd's desk, formed a disturbing picture. In the last quarter, nearly $40,000 had disappeared from the account, always in cash, always in small amounts of $3,000 or $4,000. The dates of the withdrawals coincided with her grandson's visits. In the safe, which it was possible to open only with the help of a specialist, found a will. Margaret left all her capital, almost $1 million, to create a music school for gifted children from low-income families. Hunter was destined only for the old house on Elm Street. She knew, Floyd said quietly, looking over the documents, knew the money wouldn't go to a good cause. That's why she rewrote the will 3 weeks ago. In a nearby office, Talia was recounting the events of the last few weeks for the third time. With each repetition, the story grew with new details, significant touches that were only now coming to mind. She remembered how Hunter always hid his right hand under the table at her grandmother's house, where he had a snake tattoo, how he looked around nervously when receiving phone calls, how his voice changed when money was involved. Detectives have been methodically collecting evidence: fingerprints on the broken window, size 43 boot prints on the wet ground under the back door, leather jacket fibers on the thorny hedge branches. By late afternoon, the CCTV footage had arrived. 3 different angles showed the same story. At 11 p.m., an argument on the porch. At 1:30 in the morning, a dark figure at the back door. At 2 a.m., the same man walking hurriedly toward a parked car. Forensics confirmed that the gait, build, even the tilt of the head matched Hunter's movements, but there was no face on the footage. In the bar west corner, the detectives were met with dead silence, and the bartender methodically wiping glasses. All they could learn from him was about an abandoned warehouse in an old factory across the river where the red snakes gathered. The neighborhood of the old factory greeted them with rusty gates and the resounding echo of footsteps. The empty windows of the abandoned workshop stared blindly at the scene. Inside, they found traces of recent human presence: cigarette butts, empty bottles, scattered syringes. On the wall was a stylized graffiti of a red snake wielding a dagger. In the far corner of the warehouse, there was a small room with a metal safe. Inside were stacks of bills and a notebook with names and amounts, Hunter's handwriting, dates matching the withdrawals from Margaret's account. And at the Elm Street house, forensics found one last piece of evidence: a crumpled note in a trash can. Margaret's handwriting, firm and decisive. "I'm sorry, Hunter, I can't give you that money. You know why. I've turned a blind eye to your problems for too long. This has to end." On the back of the note was scribbled in chemical pencil, 15,000, last time. Otherwise everyone will know. In Detective Floyd's office, the phone rang. An informant reported seeing a man who looked like Hunter at the old gas station on the way out of town. He wasn't alone. Several other motorcyclists with red snake tattoos were riding with him. The police station was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. In the past 24 hours, 6 members of the Red Snakes had been detained. They were interrogated in different offices, recording every word, every gesture, every reservation. Byron Holt, the leader of the gang, held himself with confidence. Tall, with a military bearing and a scar across his cheek, he answered clearly and matter-of-factly. Yes, he knows Hunter Ironwood. Yes, he'd been a member of the gang for the last 2 years. No, not aware of his family business. "He was bringing in money," Byron said, looking straight into Detective Shaw's eyes. "From where, we weren't interested. The rules are simple. Don't ask, don't tell." In the next room, a young biker with trembling hands was telling a different story. Hunter often talked about his rich grandmother, about how she didn't understand real life, about money that could have been put to good use. He was getting more and more twitchy. The kid twirled the water glass in his hands nervously. Especially after Jade, said his grandmother betrayed him, that she chose her principles over her family. The wiretaps of the last week's phone calls painted a picture of growing desperation. Hunter had called various people, asking for a loan, promising to pay it back with interest. More and more often, he sounded panic. The last conversation with Margaret took place an hour before her death. Hunter's voice trembled with rage. "You know what they'll do to me! 15,000 and that's it! I'll never ask for anything more!" Margaret's calm voice. "I'm sorry, honey. I can't be an accessory anymore. Tomorrow we'll go to the rehab center. Together. I'll pay for everything." Talia spent all day at the station answering endless questions. In the evening, she returned to her apartment, exhausted and devastated. In the bathroom, something caught her eye. Barely visible brown stains on the mat. She remembered Hunter stopping by the night before Margaret died. She remembered that he'd showered and changed his clothes. She hadn't paid much attention to it then. In the dumpster behind the house, she found a bag of clothes. A leather jacket, jeans, a dark t-shirt, all with brown stains. In the pocket of the jacket was a crumpled sheet with the address of a private clinic and the amount, $15,000. That same night, the results of the forensic examination of the blood from the crime scene were received. 3 types of traces: Margaret's blood on the keys and floor, the killer's blood on a shard of broken window, and drops of blood on the back door. They led to the alley. Genetic testing confirmed the blood belonged to Hunter Ironwood. Investigators found a stash house in the old factory. Behind a fake wall, dozens of bags of drugs, guns, fake IDs, and notes, dates, amounts, names, Hunter's handwriting, the story of his downfall written in numbers and short notes. Floyd and Shaw studied the records into the night. Hunter started small, taking money from his grandmother, supposedly for school. Then the amounts grew. He was sinking deeper and deeper into the criminal world, entangled in debt and obligation. Jade was the final straw. Her death pushed him over the edge. $15,000 was the price of a human life. And when Margaret said no, something snapped finally. Now all that was left was to find him. Alerts were sent out to every post. The police combed the city block by block, but Hunter seemed to vanish into thin air, until a tip came in from an informant. A group of bikers had been spotted on an old logging road leading to the Canadian border. Dawn painted the sky over the industrial area a dirty pink. Police cars without sirens took up positions around abandoned warehouses. Detective Floyd, crouched behind a concrete fence, held her walkie-talkie to her lips. Everyone in position, waiting for the signal. The informant didn't fail. A group of bikers were indeed sheltering in the old warehouse complex. Hunter Ironwood was among them. His motorcycle stood at the far entrance, ready for a quick start. The operation had been planned all night. Detective Shaw placed snipers on the roofs of neighboring buildings. The extraction teams had taken every possible escape route. The trap seemed flawless. The first rays of sunlight touched the metal roof of the warehouse. At that moment, an engine roared inside. The massive gate swung open with a rumble, and a black motorcycle flew out onto the road. Behind it, scattering gravel, 4 more bikes rushed out. "Let's go!" Shaw's voice on the radio cut through the morning silence. Police cars sped off, sirens blaring. The chase was on. The bikers split up at the intersection. 4 went toward the harbor, and 1, Hunter, steered his motorcycle into the maze of narrow streets in the industrial zone. Floyd and Shaw didn't hesitate to rush after him. The bike looped between rusty containers, ducked under overpasses, flew into empty lots. Hunter drove the bike like a virtuoso, on the edge of possibility, balancing life and death at every turn. "He wants to get to the railroad tracks!" shouted Floyd, twisting the handlebars. "You can get away on the old branch line there!" Shaw was squeezing everything he could out of the engine. The distance between the police car and the motorcycle shrank, then widened again. The chase turned into an eerie dance in the city's backroads. Suddenly, a concrete wall grew up ahead, a dead end. Hunter turned the motorcycle sharply, but there was no other way out. All the paths were blocked by police cars. In the ring of flashing lights, he looked like a hunted animal. "Drop your weapons! Come out with your hands up!" Shaw's voice echoed off the walls in a megaphone. Instead of answering, Hunter drew his gun. The first bullet shattered the windshield of the police car. A gunfight began. Floyd saw his face through the scope, distorted with rage and fear, so much like the picture of the smiling boy with the music contest trophy. What turns a talented child into a killer? Where is the point of no return after which you can't undo everything? Shaw's bullet hit Hunter in the shoulder. The gun fell out of his hand. The bike went sideways. It was over. Detective Floyd snapped the handcuffs on Hunter's wrists. "Hunter Ironwood, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Margaret Ironwood." He remained silent, looking somewhere through her. Only when he was being led to the police car did he say quietly, "She could have just given me that money. Just give me the damn 15,000. The rising sun painted the industrial zone blood red. Somewhere in the distance, police sirens still sounded. The chase for the rest of the gang was on. But the main hunt was over. In the pocket of Hunter's jacket, they found a crumpled photograph of him as a child, sitting at a piano, with Margaret standing next to him, putting her hand on his shoulder. They are smiling. On the back is a faded inscription, "To my dear grandson, music will never betray." The interrogation room was semi-dark. Hunter Ironwood, with his shoulder bandaged and handcuffs on his wrists, sat motionless, staring at one point. Detectives Floyd and Shaw waited. They knew. Sometimes silence spoke louder than words. "I didn't mean to kill her," Hunter finally said. His voice sounded muffled, lifeless. "I just wanted to talk, to explain, make her understand." He began to tell. The story flowed like a dam bursting. About how he'd met Jade at a classical concert 2 years ago. She was sitting alone, in a worn denim jacket, crying as she listened to Chopin. She was so pure, broken, but pure, like my grandmother's music. Jade lived a life of music and heroin. The latter was slowly crowding out the former. Hunter tried to help, but instead found himself caught up in a maelstrom of drugs and crime. The Red Snakes took them both in. Byron promised protection, money, freedom. Soon, Hunter could no longer distinguish where the promises ended and the addiction began. To drugs, to adrenaline, to the power of money. My grandmother would give me money as long as she thought it was for school, for business. She wanted to believe in me, and then she started asking questions. When Jade found herself in critical condition, Hunter was sure a private clinic would be a lifesaver. $15,000 for life. Margaret said no. She said only official treatment, only the right way. But what was the right way? Jade would have been arrested. She'd die in a prison hospital. That night he returned through the back door, took the familiar route to the music room. Margaret was playing the same Chopin nocturne that had been played the first time he'd met Jade. I only wanted to scare her, to take the money out of the safe. I knew the code. But she said she'd already rewritten the will, that all the money would go to the music school, that she would no longer indulge my self-destruction. A bronze bust of Chopin stood on the piano, heavy, cold. I don't remember how it happened. I only remember the sound, deafening like a broken string, and the silence afterward. The detectives were silent. Outside the window, the noise of the city was growing. A new day was beginning. Somewhere in the hallway, Talia was crying. At the trial, Hunter kept a straight face. He listened calmly to the prosecution, didn't try to justify himself. When he was given the last word, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "These are sheet music, Brahms' lullaby. My grandmother taught me to play it when my parents died. Said music cured all pain. She was wrong. Some wounds never heal." The court sentenced him to life in prison without parole. It was quiet that night in the old house on Elm Street. Dust was settling on the keys of the piano. Maples rustled outside the window. And on the wall in a frame hung the program for a children's music contest. Hunter Ironwood, 12 years old, first place.